Okay, let's try to unpack this. We've been looking at this mountain of documents for days. We're talking federal indictments, DHS intelligence reports, court filings.
Right. And they all tell just one unbelievable story. It's so coordinated. It really just changes how you think about fraud in America.
It really does. Because we're talking about a nationwide fraud enterprise, a system that allegedly siphoned billions, not millions, billions of taxpayer dollars. And it all ends with this huge, politically explosive policy change from the White House.
And that's the key thing for you to understand, the thing that makes this deep dive so critical. It's the starting point. I mean, we're tracking this sprawling federal case that went from a local arrest.
Of a single guy, a city councilor in Maine.
Exactly. A local arrest for gun theft, of all things. And that one event somehow leads to the White House authorizing what a senior official called the largest domestic fraud manhunt in U.S. history.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to follow that thread. We have to connect the dots and figure out how a seemingly minor local crime just ripped the whole thing open.
Right.
So the core question is just massive. How does an arrest over gun charges at a drug house in Maine become the key that unlocks, and I'm quoting prosecutors here, the biggest welfare fraud enterprise in U.S. history?
And you really have to pause on that phrase. Federal prosecutors, they just don't use language like biggest in history unless they have something monumental.
No, that's career-defining language.
It is. That single claim suggests the theft, specifically from emergency programs like COVID aid. It reached into the multiple billions. And that explains why they suddenly pulled in DHS, the IRS, the DOJ, all these multi-state task forces.
And the sources are really clear on this. The administration didn't just put out a press release. They ordered an immediate massive crackdown. This wasn't shuffling papers.
No, it was a direct mandate for action.
Yeah.
And it was swift. It all started with what looked like, just another local crime.
Okay, so let's start right there. At the place our sources say the whole thing just detonated, the collision point in Maine. The event was the arrest of a Somali city councilor, Ilhan Osman. And when federal agents grabbed him, they had no idea they were basically pulling the pin on a national grenade.
That's a perfect way to put it. The charges themselves were serious federal gun theft charges, but it was the setting of the crime that immediately got intelligence analysts paying attention.
He was tied to a condemned drug house. That's the quote from the report.
Yes, and this wasn't some minor thing. Federal agents had already raided that exact location. They'd seized a huge cache of narcotics. We're talking meth, fentanyl, cocaine, and multiple firearms.
So right away, this isn't just a corrupt local politician. This is someone connected, deeply connected, to violent organized crime.
Absolutely. A city councilor mixed up with fentanyl distribution and stolen weapons. That is not your typical city hall corruption case.
Right.
It signaled a level of criminality that was, way beyond just local graft. You're looking at organized crime structures, not just one bad apple.
And then there was this immediate attempt to deflect, which just backfired completely. When police asked for his proof of residency, to hold office.
His lawyers claimed he was getting death threats.
Right. A very emotional, very powerful claim to make.
It's a classic deflection strategy. But the police checked, and they confirmed. No such threats had ever been reported. There was no record. The whole story was a lie.
And that lie brings us to what the sources say is the most crucial part of this whole thing, the timing. This arrest in Maine happened the exact same week that federal agencies were preparing totally separate fraud indictments in Minnesota.
1,000 miles away. And for intelligence analysts, that overlap was the first giant red flag. They knew right away this couldn't be a coincidence.
They called it a collision point.
They did. The simultaneous discovery of a politician tied to violent crime in Maine and these massive financial fraud rings in Minnesota, both with similar, let's say, demographic and organizational fingerprints. That was the spark hitting the gasoline.
So this wasn't some isolated case in a small town anymore. It was the first domino. And that specific combination, the drugs, the guns, and the falsified residency, that was the key.
And that's when analysts in D.C. had what they called their freeze moment. They realized the tactics in the Osmond case, how they got the weapons, how they faked official documents, the organized nature of it all. It mirrored the patterns they were seeing in the Minnesota financial cases.
So the local arrest in Maine basically provided the Rosetta Stone to read the bigger conspiracy.
It unlocked the whole thing. The feds immediately started connecting cases they had previously thought were totally unrelated.
Okay, let's get into that process, because this is where you start to see the outline of this massive coordinated system. What was the common thread they started finding in all these old cases?
It was the organizational DNA. The way the fraud was being executed was identical across different states and different programs. I mean, the list of schemes they connected is just, it's sprawling.
Walk us through. What kind of schemes are we talking about here?
Okay, so it starts with the big one everyone already knew about, the Feeding Our Future fraud in Minneapolis. But from there, they linked it to money laundering patterns in Maine, suspicious nonprofit transfers tied to COVID aid.
All the pandemic money.
All of it. Plus, housing schemes, fake autism therapy billing scams, and systemic welfare overpayments that were being funneled through what the sources call clan-based informal networks.
So for years, these things were just being written off as, what, one-off cases. A corrupt nonprofit here, a shady landlord there.
That's the critical point. The Osmond arrest, because it linked guns and hard drugs to the fraud, it set off alarms all the way up the chain of command. It screamed systemic corruption, not isolated incidents.
What was the proof, though? I mean, what made the coordination so undeniable?
It was the patterns. They found the same unique surnames popping up in corporate filings in different states. They found identical legal language used to set up shell companies and nonprofits. And critically, they found the same financial fingerprints, the same money routes, appearing over and over again in databases in Maine, Minnesota, Ohio, and Washington.
So it was statistically impossible for it to be random.
Impossible. And that led to the big conclusion. This wasn't just a bunch of criminals all having the same bad idea. This was a system designed by a coordinated group to exploit federal programs across the country.
And the DHS official had that chilling quote.
He did. He said, "This wasn't random crime. This was a system, a coordinated nationwide system hiding in plain sight." And the Osmond arrest was the key that unlocked the entire structure.
It was the template. They weren't just chasing individual criminals anymore.
They had found the blueprint for the whole maze.
And that blueprint led them straight back to Minnesota, the Twin Cities, specifically. Our sources are calling it the financial engine for this entire national enterprise.
Right. And most people, they'd heard of the big scandal there, Feeding Our Future. That was the one that hit the news.
Over $250 million.
Yeah.
Money meant for hungry kids that just vanished. Went to luxury cars, real estate, overseas transfers.
And here's where this deep dive really adds the value. Because that $250 million, as staggering as it is, was just the surface layer. The intel from the Osmond arrest helped investigators realize that the food scandal was just one branch of an entire ecosystem of fraud.
All running at the same time through the same network.
Exactly. It was a coordinated portfolio of crime. When they peeled back that top layer, they found interconnected schemes involving housing stabilization fraud, fake autism services, inflated daycare billing.
Wait, fake autism services? How does that even work? How do you fake something like that?
Well, this is where the system's own complexity becomes its weakness. Autism therapy is a high reimbursement service, often paid by Medicaid. It relies a lot on trust and documentation. So the network created fake clinics.
Fake buildings.
Or they'd use real ones, but bill for services never rendered. They'd submit claims for, say, 40 hours of intensive therapy for a child who wasn't even in the country. They used stolen identities, recycled reports. It was a paper mill.
And it's harder to audit than, say, a shipment of food.
Much harder. It takes time, interviews, credential checks. They exploited that time lag for years. The same goes for the housing fraud. They'd use pandemic relief funds, create fake tenants, fake landlords, and pay the rent money from a nonprofit to a shell company they controlled. A direct siphon.
So with billions of dollars moving around, they couldn't just be using cash. How did the money flow? And where was it going that got the White House to react so fast?
It flowed through what the intelligence reports call clan-based informal economies. This is so important to understand. It's a system of money transfer that operates outside of regulated banks.
Hold on. Explain that. How does an informal economy move billions of dollars in welfare fraud under the radar?
It works on trust. Instead of a wire transfer, you give money to a trusted broker in, say, Minneapolis. That broker calls a counterpart in Dubai or Nairobi and tells them to release the same amount of money to someone there.
So the money never actually crosses a border through a bank?
Not initially. The debt between the brokers is settled later, maybe through trade or cash or commodities. It's lightning fast and leaves almost no paper trail for auditors to follow.
That's terrifyingly efficient. And I'm guessing that leads us to the national security part of this.
That's the detail that changed everything. The intelligence briefings, based on tracing where that money was ending up, showed that funds were moving overseas toward extremist link groups.
So money stolen from programs for American kids with autism was potentially being used to fund extremist groups abroad.
That's what the intelligence suggested, and that single detail elevates this from a massive domestic crime to an urgent national security crisis. It wasn't just about stolen taxpayer money anymore.
It was about the U.S. government accidentally funding its enemies.
Precisely. And that's why the DHS report was so conclusive. It called the fraud structured, strategic, and years in the making, and it identified that Minneapolis network as the financial engine for all of it.
So when this lands on President Trump's desk,
He didn't hesitate. The combination of the scale of the theft and the national security threat was the catalyst. He ordered a nationwide sweep, not a review, a sweep, targeting every suspected COVID aid fraud ring tied to these networks.
and the collaboration was just unprecedented for a domestic case. Multi-state task forces, DHS, IRS, DOJ, all working together.
It was a massive mobilization of federal power. A senior federal attorney literally called it the largest domestic fraud manhunt in U.S. history. He said these coordinated groups were exploiting loopholes faster than the government could even write the rules.
It's like they were treating the pandemic relief programs as their own personal, unrestricted ATM.
That's the picture the evidence paints, and that leads directly to the political and policy shockwave.
The termination of temporary protected status, TPS, for Somali nationals. I mean, that decision sent a massive earthquake through the political landscape.
And to really get it, you need the context. TPS is a humanitarian shield. It protects people from deportation if their home country is too dangerous to return to. It had been expanded under the previous administration for Somalia.
But the fraud investigation uncovered what federal agents called widespread exploitation of that very status.
Yes, that's the link. That's the justification for the policy reversal. During the financial probe, they found evidence of duplicated identities being used for benefits, fraudulent asylum claims, and critically, people using TPS protection as a cover while they were participating in these fraud schemes.
So the administration's logic was, if this humanitarian status is being systematically used as a tool by criminal networks to drain our resources, then its integrity is gone.
That was the official position. It was about restoring the rule of law. And the termination meant that thousands of people who relied on that status were suddenly facing new interviews, intense background checks, and even immediate deportation.
Which created this massive clash.
Yeah.
You had to pick a side.
Immediately. Law enforcement called it necessary to stop the organized crime, but the political left immediately framed it as cruelty, as an attack on an entire community.
And the streets just exploded within minutes of the announcement, right? Minneapolis, Seattle, Columbus.
The response was instant. Protests ignited. The sources described crowds blocking intersections surrounding federal buildings. There were confrontations, fireworks being thrown at police lines.
It was chaos.
And the activist narrative immediately shifted to claiming the president was criminalizing immigrants, which completely overshadowed the evidence of the massive fraud network that prosecutors were trying to dismantle.
But your analysis, based on the intel reports, suggests this wasn't just emotional outrage. This chaos was strategic.
The sources strongly suggest that. Think about it. The entire criminal infrastructure was collapsing. Arrests were imminent. Deportation orders were active. The nonprofits and community centers built on this stolen money were about to fold.
So the protest served a purpose.
A strategic purpose. To create chaos. To slow down the federal agents, and to reframe a criminal investigation as a political attack on identity. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort to save the network.
And while all this is happening, the firestorm gets even bigger because of the campaign finance connection.
This is what turned a criminal story into a full-blown political crisis. Federal filings showed that several high-profile Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota had taken tens of thousands of dollars in campaign donations.
From who?
From individuals who were now indicted in the Feeding Our Future network, the key players, the people facing wire fraud charges and cutting plea deals.
No way. So the money from the alleged fraud was going directly into the campaign accounts of state politicians.
The record showed a direct financial link. And when the politicians were confronted, you got the predictable excuses.
We returned the money. We didn't know.
Exactly. But the public skepticism was immense. I mean, the sentiment quoted in the sources was pretty stark. When Democrat officials were shaking hands and cashing checks, the fraudsters were bleeding federal programs dry.
It created this unavoidable perception that the fraud was operating with, at best, political blindness, and at worst, political protection.
And that political explosion really set the stage for the final phase, the narrative war and the full-scale crackdown.
Right. The moment the campaign finance story hit, it became all about damage control. So how did the legacy media, the big networks, how did they frame this story?
The sources point to a very consistent strategy. First, downplay the actual fraud. Second, deflect from the arrests and the evidence. And third, aggressively question the motives of the federal prosecutors.
Suggesting it was all politically motivated.
Yes, you had anchors calling the raids controversial and the TPS termination cruel. They painted the protests as this understandable organic backlash against government overreach.
And what was being left out of those reports? What's the contrast?
The sources are blunt about this. They say the media largely failed to mention the billions of dollars missing. They failed to talk about the kids who never got the food. They ignored the years of systemic exploitation of taxpayer programs. The focus was almost entirely on framing the accused as victims.
And we saw political figures pushing that exact narrative.
We did. Representative Ilhan Omar, for example, argued on TV that the fraud was mainly because of program design flaws, that the government rushed out pandemic aid without enough guardrails.
Wait a minute. Okay, a system might have flaws, but that doesn't excuse a criminal for exploiting it. I mean, what did that argument leave out?
It completely sidesteps the core findings of the intelligence community. The sources note she didn't mention the highly organized criminal network, the financial blueprints found in 5 different states, or the cultural patterns like clan loyalties that Somali scholars themselves have identified as factors in this.
So the defense was basically, it's the government's fault for creating a tempting system, not the criminal's fault for systematically robbing it blind for years.
That was the fundamental conflict. It was identity politics versus accountability. It was narratives versus documented, hard financial fraud.
But the investigators had the receipts. They had the evidence.
They had the reality check. They had names, wire transfers, organizational charts. The narrative of this being some kind of misunderstanding or just a few accounting errors was impossible for them to accept. The evidence was just too overwhelming.
And then came the moment nobody could ignore anymore. The actual physical crackdown. Federal tactical teams rolling into Minneapolis before dawn.
It was a massive show of force, and it was designed to be unmistakable. We're talking armored vehicles, ICE teams, Homeland Security agents, over 100 federal officers surging into the Twin Cities. They were targeting specific people, specific properties.
The sources say it was highly targeted, not random.
Very targeted, and according to officials, long overdue. They had to move simultaneously to prevent evidence from being destroyed. And for people on the ground, this was the first time they were seeing undeniable physical proof of the corruption that had been operating right under their noses.
So while the media was screaming about the tactics, the agents were just focused on the mission.
Asset forfeiture and detention. And that crackdown confirmed the initial theory. This was never just a Minnesota problem. The financial trails they uncovered there led them to identical operations in other states.
They found the same fingerprints everywhere.
The exact same fingerprints. Shell companies with the same structure. Money being routed through the same overseas channels. They found it in Ohio, Washington, Maine, Colorado, and Texas.
So what looked like a bunch of small-time COVID scams were actually all connected. One national structure moving money with incredible speed and precision.
Exactly. And that's when analysts became convinced that this really might be the largest welfare fraud enterprise in U.S. history, dwarfing anything seen before. The arrest in Maine wasn't the end of the story. It was just the door that opened onto this massive national web of corruption.
Which brings us to the end of this, to the synthesis of this incredible moment. Our sources describe December 2025 as a time when political optics just shattered against the hard reality of the evidence.
Right. With billions missing and a national security threat confirmed, the public reached a breaking point where action was simply unavoidable.
And the administration's new doctrine was just, enough is enough.
That's the phrase they used. The focus shifted entirely to restoring integrity to the aid programs and protecting national security, and they decided to do that regardless of the political optics. The decision to terminate TPS, however controversial, was a signal that they were willing to confront a system that had been exploited for years.
So the big takeaway for you, for the listener, isn't just the insane amount of money that was stolen. It's the sheer organizational effort that went into it.
It's the depth of it. This exposed a fundamental systemic weakness in how we distribute and monitor federal aid. A weakness so profound that it took a random local police action in Maine to finally uncover it on a national scale.
It also shows how these criminal networks can use our own political and social structures against us. They hide behind campaign donations and cries of bias to shield themselves.
They do. And it forces us to ask some really tough questions. The cost of being reluctant to investigate, for fear of being called biased, might actually be billions of dollars and years of unchecked criminal activity.
It's just staggering. If a system this massive, this sophisticated, could hide in plain sight for years by exploiting our own rules.
Then what other fraud enterprises might be operating right now? Using different community structures or different federal programs, what are they relying on to stay invisible?
That other guardrails are still missing from our systems. And what is the final bill going to be for the American taxpayer before we finally secure them? That's the question we're left with as this whole thing continues to unfold.